I think ever since I got into Warhammer 40k, there have been people suggesting this particular fictional universe, being BattleTech. Up until that point, I had never heard anything about it. I do know that there is a BattleTech game, which I do in fact own now. And I know that it has to do with, you know, mechas. But I believe this was the video that was suggested as a good entryway into the series, so today I decided to check it out. But of course, before we begin, as always, make sure you go support the OG video. Link to that is always at the top of the description. For now, let's see what BattleTech is about. Oh, that's cute. You have no choice. Thank you for at least being honest with me. Basic manual for new mech warriors. Okay. Great houses.
Welcome, new mech warriors, to the Inner Sphere, where you can keep whatever money you find so long as you live to payday. For our first lesson, the great houses. Slide.
Okay, so just with that, I'm assuming multiple different mercenary groups may be working for particular companies that have kind of monopolized certain areas of the galaxy. That, or maybe there's like a noble family system going on here.
Please. So the great houses are the 6, or for people who can actually calculate projection power on an appreciable strategic scale, the 4 peer states, 1 remnant, and 1 hermit kingdom that make up the Inner Sphere. No, it's not a perfect sphere. Yes, there are things outside of it. Today we're talking about these assholes. These are the great houses of the Inner Sphere, and they're all very different in varying ways, but are mostly the same, in that they are all occasionally not very nice to each other. They also possess vast arsenals of planet-killing weapons, and on special occasion will trundle them out for public display. If you want to know why these people are fighting over such vast territory and why they're so committed to erasing portions of their collective industrial base, history, and civilization, well, it's complicated.
I'm going to assume it might have to do with resources. That's usually what happens when it comes to space warfare. And I wonder if there are like any alien species within this universe. Maybe that's not what we're going for here.
My best take on it is a 2-parter, and most people find that a bit much. So let this serve as a basic introduction to your career in the world of mech warriors, and a primer on who's most likely to kill you when you inevitably fuck up. But firstly, a disclaimer. I am biased. As a mercenary plying his trade in the Inner Sphere, I find concepts such as warfighting ideology largely a position of what you can cover up from the general public. Mainly because, at the end of the day in the Inner Sphere, it's about you and yours, and smoking craters tell no tales. They make a hell of an autocannon. But to better illustrate my point, let's just dive in. This map is from 3067. Maps from after that are somewhat messed up, for a number of reasons. And on an unrelated note, let's just brush this radioactive ash off here, and there we go. 3067. Don't mind the flickering on the screen. I'm told it's mostly harmless. Mostly. Let's begin with the great houses themselves. I'll be moving clockwise as we go for those of you who understand time, and left-hand feed for people who understand timing.
Okay, Draconis Combine. How's Kurita? Don't know if that's how you say that.
Welcome to the wacky, weird world of the Draconis Combine. Welcome to a pervasive class system, and home to the galaxy's own homegrown, no-bullshit, sword-wielding, authoritarian samurai ruling class.
Gotcha.
Oh yes. This place is literally built off pre-spaceflight Terran Shogunate-era Japan. It's a monolithic, all-encompassing bureaucratic machine run on war and conquest that thinks optimal Christmas dinner is, by tradition, fried chicken. They're a fun collection of ideas. Behold, this is their throne room. Take that in. This isn't just for show. This is their military. These are their uniforms. These are their mechs.
Yo,
they fight like this
that's awesome.
all the time. Yes, those swords are very real, and do brutal
Heck
work.
yeah.
Alright, so back to the guy in the chair.
That looks really cool.
It is frequently a guy in charge of this. So this guy is called the coordinator. He runs the place.
Coordinator,
There's
okay.
very little distinction between the coordinator as a person and the Draconis Combine as a whole. When people refer to the dragon in reference to Kurita as a house or a nation, it's interchangeable between the two entities. And
Okay.
no, the Draconis Combine doesn't celebrate the godhood of rulership with divine mandate. However, the coordinator's word carries essentially the same weight within their sphere of influence, so I'd not invite trouble, as Kurita tends to bury its enemies deep, headless, and by the million. They have no issues with troubleshooting in government, as trouble should be shot in the Draconis Combine.
Troubleshooting?
Anything to
Great
fear
joke.
from these guys, it's that they believe in a manifest destiny, which involves House Kurita controlling everything. The Draconis Combine started as an agreement between two worlds, which was then fed war and conquest through House Kurita's leadership. Kurita has had total control since the beginning, aside from that one cadet branch that one time in the family who was wiped out long ago. As far as how this thing runs, well, the 5 pillars represent the Draconis Combine. The pillar of gold is the government, the pillar of steel is the military, the pillar of teak is the people, the pillar of ivory is religion, philosophy, zen, and all that crap. And then there's jade, the economy. These 5 pillars of state philosophy are represented in the ministries of state organized through them. For instance, the pillar of steel encompasses the Ministry of War, the Department of Indoctrination, the Bureau of Substitution, the Assembly of the Grand Inquisitor, the Admiralty, the physician staff of the Dragon, and various minor administration authorities. Speaking of authorities, Draconis Combine bureaucracy tends to be impenetrable to outsiders, impossible to reason with, and largely maintains the status quo. Actual decisions are typically made by people with significant military rank, in the form of military governors appointed to oversee civilian authorities.
Okay, this is actually a pretty deep dive into the way that things are governed within each house. I wasn't expecting, or, well, rather, I didn't know how deep the BattleTech lore went, but yeah, this is pretty cool. And I mean, of course, we have like the usual sci-fi or really fantasy thing where we take real world cultures and then we mix certain aspects of it with something else and create something completely unique. I will say though that, I mean, obviously you guys probably know based off of my reaction to the mech designs, but these guys look pretty cool. And the color red, it's a pretty good color. oh, Zero, how? Judging from your VTuber design, I could never guess. But now this also makes me curious, since we have like established governments and how they run, and probably like the relationships with the other houses as well. It makes me think of how this came to be in the first place, like the timeline of the series. I suppose we'll have to discover that later.
When in doubt, the decision maker is typically the one with the sword. And if you want to see that sword up close and real fast, you only need to fail to take its bearer seriously, or merely disrespect their presence. Also, they had this whole death to mercenaries thing for a while. Not my favorite government to work with. Then again, they rarely need mercenaries ever, because the constant fighting and insanity of the samurai class means they're pretty much ready to throw down whenever.
Yeah.
If they lack a cause, they'll find one quick. The leaders of the Draconis
Manifest
military
destiny.
are often peerless warlords, equally at home in local shogunal politics or on the battlefields of their neighbors. The Draconis Combine is the state that war built, maintained by Bushido, psychotic warriors, and a shitload of weapons. Finding Kurita forces in your backyard is frequently the precursor to speaking Japanese in your near future, whether you want to or not.
All right, cool. So actually, it's pretty cool. Federated
Next door
Sons
is
and
ruled
House
by House
Davion.
Davion, the so-called good
Davion.
kid of the successor houses. The noble one. The one that likes autocannons a lot. That's these
Trying to be
guys.
the good guys, okay.
Technically, the state is the Federated Sons, and they're another fun monarchy. House Davion is descended from English and French nobility, operating as constitutionally bound monarchs, and has been, since ever, trying to reinforce their position as champions of liberty and personal freedom at every annoying turn. Because of this, Most people think House Davion, and by extension, the Federated Sons, are self-righteous assholes. And they are not wrong. Mostly. But see, the story is a bit funny on that. Originally, the Federated Sons was a federation. In time, the founding polities chose delegates to form a high council who would, among themselves, elect a president to lead them. But the political machinations of the Davion family were all about having a monarchy, so they pushed the presidency into that, and since then, the Davion family has ruled, which is really good for them, mostly good for the Federated Sons, and has worked out for the most part. However, Davions being Davions, one had to rule them all, so there was an early Davion civil war. The 5 marches had to decide for themselves who would be the first prince, and sharing was, apparently, not a serious consideration at any point. And the winner of that first early Davion civil war, Alexander Davion, went on to pass more legislation than any of his predecessors.
One man, one vote, parentheses, his.
Because he had total military support. Turns out you can make people vote how you want with a bayonet. However, the story doesn't get any worse really for some time at least. To their credit, House Davion was not a despot. They encouraged then and still champion free speech, individual liberties, and personal freedom. But in the end, it is a monarchy. Considering the mostly beneficial ruling arrangement, some will label Davion a father knows best state, which has many times but not always been justified in its actions. As such, it is seen as one of the more stable houses on account of broad public support. I will admit this. Though they can be miserably righteous and annoying, they're frequently not evil, just smug, and yes, that is just as bad. The armed forces of the Federated Sons have historically been one of the most professional militaries in the Inner Sphere, originally formed from peacekeepers and always kept as modern as state industries could allow. These guys
I mean, looking at that mech design, it kind of reminds me of like I forget the exact term. It's like the helmets that the Romans used to have, something like a Roman centurion would wear, maybe. But obviously, now sci-fi mech.
And developed the predecessors to the Warhammer on their own dime in the earliest years of battle mechs. Even when they're wrong, they're almost right. Davion may not pay you well, but they won't bury you for no reason. Mostly.
Roger that. Things have just worked out for them. I see. And the people follow it because, you know, it worked out. Capellan.
Next door are these guys. I don't like them as much for a number of reasons. The Capellan Confederation is the youngest kid on the block as successor states go. It's a socialistic police state that has almost but not always been under the control of one family, House Liao. The head of the state is the Chancellor, who is, in the Capellan Confederation, one nod away from making you disappear. To say that it is a police state is not an act of hyperbole, but substantiated fact. However, it wasn't always so. What started as a collection of states uniting for common defense and well-being slowly grew over hundreds of years through successive generations of philosophy and leadership from one house into an autocratic state with a centrally controlled economy. Some would say this is a functional dictatorship, but dictators tend toward having some sort of functional agenda or understanding of strategic power. But in truth, there's actually 3 forces that run this place, at least in theory. They are the Chancellor, the Prefectorate, and the House of Scions. The Chancellor is the CIC of the Armed Forces, Special Forces, and the face of the state in matters of foreign policy. The Chancellor can also make decrees and legislative changes at will. It's a powerful position, to say the least, and has nearly always been a lifetime appointment for House Liao. The Prefectorate is the body of state regional entities and greater nobility. The House of Scions isn't, mostly. Needless to say, the Chancellor seems to get his or her way more often than not. But the other 2 governmental branches will act to frustrate or block particular agendas. What's interesting about the Capellan Confederation is that its citizens, or rather I should say resident aliens born there, are not citizens. Not yet, anyways. In fact, in the Confederation, citizenship must be earned, and the state is the sole measure of that esteem. Children are legally, in every way, wards of the state under limited provisional supervision granted by the government to their parents or other assigned legal guardians. At age 15, each child is thoroughly examined by the government to see if they have a proven commitment to the state. Those who are deemed worthy gain citizenship. Those who are...
Oh my god. Okay. Yeah. Very police, very militaristic controlled state. I think in Warhammer, there's actually a guardsman regiment that is specifically like this, where children at a certain age, they kind of need to serve or to prove themselves or like gain citizenship on that planet. I'm also seeing a trend here where all of these houses aren't going to be very good people in general. And I suppose that's just the nature of things within this universe and how things kind of turned out. It doesn't seem as grimdark as Warhammer 40k. Maybe we just haven't reached that stage yet. In a way, you could kind of see this as like before the dark age of technology, maybe.
Not are given a grace period for a second evaluation, but failure to measure up as a citizen for any reason results in becoming a non-citizen, which are frequently referred to as state servitors. By the success...
State servitors? We did play Mechanicus here on the channel, and the servitors there are basically just meat shields. I'm gonna assume it's probably something similar here. Either that or they're just like manual labor.
Wars, this non-citizen class had become an enormous part of the population. A population that, I must state, had no rights and was legally state property. This was reversed in 3052 when Sun Tzu Liao became chancellor and abolished servitor slavery. Not all Capellan chancellors are assholes. Most, though, well, the record speaks for itself.
Yeah.
In the military, the Confederation Armed Forces have traditionally been the underdog, but have never shied away from a fight. They frequently are pushed into doing far too much with far too little, and on top of it have to face the catastrophic political and military meddling of a chancellor who may or may not understand the difference between entertainment and war.
Oh, yikes. But yeah, being the underdogs does make a lot of sense, considering the amount of territory that they control. They would have less resources than all the other houses would.
The fact that Capellan State has not been conquered outright speaks volumes to the abilities of the CCAF, who have demonstrated battlefield insanity as a doctrine for nearly 8 centuries. The Capellan economy is centrally planned and is designed on the principle that sufficient planning can overcome any hardship. This has produced mixed results. The Confederation always endures, but at what cost?
Okay, the next house. Very British of you.
Next door is the Free Worlds League. I don't say House Merrick because, well, it's complicated. Also, their history isn't terrible as some make it out to be. Yes, the greatest threat to Americ is Americ, but glory to Merrick. But it wasn't always so. The Free Worlds League was actually formed before the Terran hegemony, born out of the early Terran Alliance's colonial struggles and then collapse as an early power. Your whole world falling apart in early colonization was, well, somewhat on the catastrophic end of things. So nations which weathered that catastrophe learned self-reliance. The Free Worlds League was originally an agreement between 3 existing nations, the Merrick Republic, the Regulan Principality, and the Federation of Oriente. Amazingly enough, the founders of the League owe most of their success to a guy named George Humphreys, who was the negotiator between the 3 nations and was honored as the first Speaker of Parliament for 5 damn sessions. They didn't throw their negotiator away when they came together as a nation. They threw nobody under the bus. Instead, they championed him. That is righteous. So how'd it go down? You see, of the 3 nations, Merrick was on top locally, and Merrick didn't like the idea of a union at all. Not at first.
Oh no.
He thought it wouldn't work. Working with others seemed like a bad idea, in fact, considering the state of galactic affairs. But Humphreys wore him down, like a good friend does, and the only reason I bring this up is because what wore him down wasn't politics. It wasn't an appeal to power or glory or riches or conquest or the history books. It was in fact nerd shit. See, Detlev Merrick collected historic awards and trophies. Raju Salaj, Prince of Regulus, collected miniatures, figurines mainly.
Oh my god. Are you telling me they bonded by playing tabletop games? Did they bond playing BattleTech? Is BattleTech a tabletop game? I don't know. Maybe they bonded by playing Warhammer. Oh god, these nerds. But I mean, isn't it such a beautiful thing? These games bringing literal nations together.
In books and paintings and the like. And these two guys nerding out about their neat stuff they liked and had collected contributed as much toward the founding of the Free Worlds League as anything else.
That's beautiful.
Ostensibly, the Free Worlds League is a federal republic, with each province granted a grand measure of self-rule and sovereignty. And as you'd expect, the Free Worlds League is a complex creature, politically speaking.
Yeah,
the Parliament is technically a supreme federal and legislative authority, but there's some caveats to that. For one, membership of the Parliament was, for a time, determined by the amount of taxes paid into the Treasury. And then there's the self-rule problem.
I see.
All that self-rule means you have all sorts of people in Parliament. Some nations could be dictatorships, others a theocracy, others a democracy, and yet...
Oh, yeah. Different ruling systems, different ideals, different goals. How do you make sure that everybody is aligned with one another? No wonder why there was that phrase at the very beginning, that the worst enemy is another Marek, because, yeah, it would be impossible to hold all of this together unless if you were an incredible statesman. And I don't think Karl Franz is in this universe.
All under one flag. Naturally, this causes some problems. It's why, for the most part, the Free Worlds League, through its history, has operated in a near-permanent state of martial law under the Captain General, who is frequently, but not always, a Merrick. Historically, the power of the Parliament has waned with every major conflict, crisis, or state of emergency, whereas the power of the...
Is that a crotch cannon? That's actually genius. Get them where they don't expect.
The Captain General has increased.
There is a lot of information being said here that I am not aware of, but obviously you can tell that the reason why these houses are the way that they are stems from the history of how, well, things came to be like this in the first place as well. Or to put it in a different way, they're not the way that they are just because it's a popular stereotype to have, but they are that way because of circumstances that led up to this, and so there's like a point where you can track where things kind of went wrong, basically. I'm super curious as to how in-depth they go into the political and economic side of things and how that would like completely shift a particular house's ideals or their goals, or maybe even their culture and how the people perceive the government as well as the other nations around them. And just how far back does the history go?
Glory to America.
What is this?
Next door is the one people make fun of, and for some of the right reasons. Welcome to the Lyran Commonwealth. First of all, few call it that unless they're declaring war or arranging marriage, which if I'm frank might be the same thing in the same afternoon. So welcome to the House of Steiner. The Steiners are the ruling family and have been since virtually ever. They were founded as a merchant and industrialist conglomerate. They never stopped being exactly that. They celebrate their vast wealth by having far too many nobles, far too many noble titles, and historically largely incompetent generals. Save for the occasional flash in the pan, that is. However, if they're strategically incompetent to the point that the concept of their scouting parties operating vastly excessive tonnage, even in modest probing actions, memes based more on truth than you think, then how do they survive, you ask? Well, money and industry, friends. Money and industry. House Steiner's backing is the industrial base and every bank that invested in it. They are the military-industrial complex. There are many good reasons they can afford to dump truck weapons into a situation, operational or not, piloted or not, and then continue to do so until the enemy leaves.
I get the feeling, and I kind of understand what's going on. if I'm to assume correctly, they're super, super rich. And even if they're incompetent, they just have so much money that they can send in more and better weapons than everybody else. You know, I don't think that's a bad problem to have. We got a ton of problems, but money isn't one of them.
While not stupendously famous for warfighting leadership or tactical brilliance, House Steiner can and will bury you with its vast assembly lines led by pretend generals until you give up or they get bored. Every tragic comedy of their strategic planning is mostly covered by the sheer power of their pervasive economy and vast military industry. In its early days, the Lyran Commonwealth was headed by 9 archons as patterned off ancient Athens of Terra, because early post-Terran colonies were like that, very idyllic. Then one guy deposed the other 8 and decided to establish the Estates General to run the show and finally hammer out some agreements on what rights meant. And it's kind of worked out. Technically, the Archon of the Lyran Commonwealth is an absolute ruler, commander-in-chief of all military forces, and can unilaterally make most governmental decisions with a modest nod. They run the show. They even hold the right to grant and remove noble titles in perpetuity, titles which hold significant power. So they're a ruthless autocrat, right? Not really. Most Archons of House Steiner, aside from a few notable assholes who need extensive covering in what I will likely label a historical diss track, are mostly okay people. They delegate most decisions to the bureaucracy, the councils of state, appointed advisors, and the Estates General, and they typically just keep their heads down, or just go to the Solaris thing. Right, the Solaris thing. So
yeah, before we get into the Solaris thing, I guess that's a better alternative to like having an incompetent leader. At least you're passing on your job to somebody who's more suitable for that position. But considering like the amount of wealth that they would have, it does make a lot of sense that most of them would just be kind of chill. Not very good at leading, but chill.
So there's a bullseye in the inner sphere in the murder for entertainment business, and it's right here. Solaris 7. This is pretty much Steiner in a nutshell. But I'm not an expert in these matters, so I'll turn it over to a local. He can sum it up better. Mr. Fisher, take it away.
Solaris 7 is the only place where you can pay money to watch 2 strangers beat each other to death, while also enjoying a corn dog.
That.
Duncan, that's not true. Canopus exists. They have corn dogs last I went, and a very good Outback.
I think Canopus banned trans fats, my dude. I've only ever seen funnel cake. Oh, and they do a lot of food on a stick. Saves napkins, less to clean up. Stick food is really the way of the future. I wish we'd thought of it first.
I agree.
Sticks truly are the yardstick of food. I'm Duncan Fisher. I stand by this statement. Sticks are the future. Mark my words.
Duncan, this is costing me a fortune.
Oh, right. HPG bills. So, Solaris 7. Murder is more or less very legal, so long as you do it in the box on TV, and everyone has a really great time.
For content!
In fact, it's fantastic. There's explosions and music.
Actually, you know what? Before we continue, I didn't know the section would go on as long as it did. There we go. That's better.
And I'm there. Every night, on every screen. I tell you all the things I think you need to hear, and most of them are very accurate. Very, very accurate. Anyways, this is Duncan Fisher signing off, and this appearance cost Professor Tex 1,485 C-bills.
Thank you, Duncan. Steiner space is a complex thing. Not good, not evil, just very big. In fact, I think that the Lyran Commonwealth is much like a cosmic horror. Some giant, blind, idiot god. Just waiting there, happily making money and strudel. Singing merrily to itself until someone comes over and flips the table. And then it becomes very, very angry. Upset.
Yeah. That's actually kind of fun. Don't know about you guys, but
Anyways, moving to our right, because space has that, we have to talk about this strip of the inner sphere that's been nothing but hell. We're not talking about these a-holes here, because they're not from here, or rather, not recently. These are the clans, and for those uninitiated, they're a strange, deep space civilization of state-mandated, eugenics program, warrior caste, combat cult weirdos. Even by our standards, they're very weird. They also got...
Oh. I guess this is our version of space barbarians.
completely wrecked by the phone company. It was a pretty okay time. For us, that is. So, here's what remains of the somewhat free Rasselhag Republic. So these guys were a thing, briefly, until these guys decided they shouldn't be. Because they were between these guys and Terra, which is controlled by the phone company, who wasn't cool with these guys taking a bite out of everything on their way to the telecoms HQ for very odd, strangely specific, quasi-spiritual reasons, which for very different, strangely specific, quasi-spiritual reasons, the phone company decided to murder them. Guys, as it turns out, you can make people show up to an ambush by just asking them. Remember, be kind, it pays dividends. Before that unpleasantness, Rasselhag was a state come from the space between House Kurita over here and House Steiner. These Kuritan buffer worlds were, before Kurita came along, an independently free principality of mostly culturally Scandinavian colonists. This small state was then overrun by House Kurita, who had to pry the worlds from them after 30 years of guerrilla warfare. They didn't go quietly. They were always a somewhat fiercely independent border region who resisted assimilation into the Draconis Combine. Over time, and some phone company intervention, Theodore Kurita was convinced of the benefits of creating a buffer zone between the houses of Steiner and Kurita by...
We keep mentioning this phone company. It seems like a very important part of the lore here. But, like, such an odd name, the phone company.
granting Rasselhag independence. Some of Kurita's guys were so mad at this that they resisted the government, and Kurita had to fight what was called the Ronin War. After Old Man Kurita gave his rowdy warriors the belt, Rasselhag became essentially a neutral buffer between the two superpowers of House Kurita and House Steiner. They were independent for almost 2 decades before these assholes came in, and in the end, they weren't anymore. This much of them survived as a rump state under the custodianship of Comstar, until 3070, when Clan Ghostbear more or less took them in. Because Ghostbear is of a similar cultural background and understands the importance of family. Good people mostly.
Family.
Kinda clingy though. For the record, Rasselhag was not a paper dragon. They collapsed only after fighting bravely in the face of overwhelming odds. They gave the clanners a hard fight on every world, and in the deep black between stars. It was a Rasselhag pilot who kamikazed the Okan's warship and stopped the invasion for a year. Rasselhag is like that. They'll smile all day, but fuck around and the Viking comes out, and it doesn't stop until you or they are very, very dead. Next up, I have to talk about this. This was once the cradle of humanity, but it's been a hotbed of a lot of historical issues. Originally, the first circuit of what was called SL Comnet was laid out in this chunk of space once called the Hegemony. Then, well, there was this guy named Jerome Blake, and as fate would have it, he'd be the last employee of SL Comnet. But some assholes in time would think that everything that poured out of his goddamn mouth was the word of...
What is going on? Is there some particular thing with this dude?
Right, so I guess next time I have to talk about the periphery, then the deep periphery. Great. Goat, play me out. Team, show these people how we pay our bills. See you next time. Stay safe.
Oh,
interesting.
Far away from the light of terror, the remnants of another.
This is the first video that I watched from Tex. This was not what I was expecting when it comes to, like, you know, lore. So my thoughts on what I learned, at least from this video about BattleTech. It seems to be a much more, I guess, trying to go for a more realistic approach to space, sci-fi, and the far future. There doesn't seem to be any aliens, and people, for the most part, at the very least, still have some form of government. or not like blindly following some god emperor and creating some weird religion around that he did not tell them to make. There also wasn't any mention of like magical or psychic powers. It must be purely based off of technology and whose mechs are better, or like whose strategy is better. I also said this earlier in the video, but this kind of makes me think of like the 40k universe, but before the dark age of technology, where everybody was just kind of expanding out into space and colonizing everything. And I suppose if we took that point in the universe and like, you know, split people into different factions that had their own interests and wanted to gain more territory and resources and go to war with each other, because that's how some of them survive and that's how others have to deal with them. I don't know in what kind of format the lore for BattleTech is told in, because I do know that there's the game, but we also showed like comic images as well, so maybe there's like a whole comic series behind it. I didn't do any research. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna Google search it right now. Ah, okay. It debuted as a board game and then since grown to several expansions to the original, several board games, role-playing games, video games, collectible card game, and a series of more than 100 novels and a TV series. I see. Yeah, as I said, like before I got into Warhammer 40k, I hadn't heard nothing about BattleTech until you guys commented about it. I would definitely be more interested to learn in like the different mechs and stuff, as well as potentially like how this all came to be, the origin story of everything, where people started exploring past the reaches of the galaxy and expanded into this space warfare that we currently have going on. But yeah, that was pretty cool. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next one.